it came as kind of a shock to me when I first understood that I, as myself, me, that I will never, I mean, not even ever, reach enlightenment. Now, how disappointing is that? And there's a reason. The reason is that myself, or the self as the Buddhists know it, is nothing more than the sum total of all my attachments, positive and negative, all of my likes and dislikes. And at best, our personal self, what we call our self, is kind of a general secretary of our life, but not any kind of permanent entity. It's not a permanent being. If it's a being, it should be some other being, because we can hear that little voice, so who's hearing it? Someone says it's time to go, you have to go to the dentist, something like that. Who's listening to someone telling us? That's our self talking. Anyway, this self montage, this assemblage we call the self, it changes as we change, as our interest changes. It's been said that like an onion, the self has no permanent core. You peel all the layers away and there's nothing, no entity there. And maybe most emphatic of all, that when we die, the self dies. The self is gone, but the mind is not. So there's a difference between the mind and the self. And that's something that it's really worthwhile learning about. So I do find the idea humorous, that should I become enlightened, someday would be nice, myself, as I now know me, won't be around to see it. Or at least that won't be the vantage point that I'm standing at, which now I'm talking to you as myself, from myself, through myself. Anyway, lots of laugh, or laughing out loud, whichever you want to do with that one. In other words, the self cannot be the natural vantage point that it appears to most of us to be now. The vantage point, the entity that we think we are, from which to survey life as we become more aware, as we become enlightened. Now, why is that? The reason is that, so I understand, is that becoming aware of the true nature of our mind is concomitant with a thinning out, goes along with a dissolving of the attachment to the self, because the self is largely consists of all our personal attachments, all our labels, all our likes and dislikes. The Buddhists say that sooner or later, all of this has to go. That is, the attachments, not the items we're attached to, like we could be attached when I was a kid, attached to a new bicycle. The bicycle can still be there, it might be rusty. It's the attachment that's not there anymore. It already is not there anymore for me. I no longer am attached to bicycles, but I am attached to cameras or lenses. We simply replace what we're attached to as we go along. Which we always have a consistent self, but what it's made up with changes as we age. Anyway, sooner or later, all of our attachments have to go. And with it goes the hope of somehow carrying the self as we know it along with us into the next world or next lifetime or rebirth. In other words, as we become more aware, the self becomes increasingly transparent or of less interest to us and less important as a place of refuge, as a point of refuge or a vantage point. We discover that the self is not, like we thought, the decider of anything. It ultimately, we begin to switch vantage point. This is the whole idea here. We stop viewing everything from the point of the self, from the point of view of ourself. We stop being selfish because we discover that vantage point, that assemblage, that self is is an exercise in futility, basically. It's not going to last. It has no permanent existence. And sooner or later, we're going to give it up anyway, certainly when we die. This is not to say that we should not have or will not have a self when we're enlightened. Of course we will, because the self is kind of a practical, personal secretary that we would have to invent if we did not already have one. We need someone to keep track of all the odds and ends. But like a good secretary, the self is a butler to something more important than or greater than, no pun intended, itself. Whatever we could agree that is. But I pointed out earlier, there seems to be a difference between what the self's telling us and whoever, whatever entity we are that's listening to it. Anyway, most of us didn't set out in life to be our own butler, to be our own secretary, because the secretary does not usually run the whole show, but it can if we let it. So in a word, we are not just ourselves, if that makes sense. The self is not all of what we are. And the point here is that while the self is not about to just dry up and blow away through meditation practice or anything, the extreme emphasis on, the extreme concern with the self, I think we call it selfishness, will gradually soften. And our awareness, our extreme focus on the self, will shift away from the vantage point it has now to something more encompassing yet, something more natural. So again, let's not forget that the Buddhists point out that this cluster of attachments, likes and dislikes that we call ourself, won't be traveling with us when we go out of this life. And they advise us not to put all our eggs into that basket. You can't depend on it, so don't count on it. Now, the way I look at it myself, and this is what I say to myself, some years ago, I reached a point in life where I just put myself kind of out to pasture, like you would out to pasture to graze like you would an old cow. And I make sure it has enough hay and enough sunshine. But I have ceased to consider myself as the be-all and end-all of anything. I mean, even at this point, I can even laugh at myself at least a little. And the proof of the pudding is that I find that I've begun to treat myself as I would treat any other person, even a stranger, with as much love, kindness, and compassion as I can manage. However, I do get reminded, and more than once by those around me, that perhaps I like myself too much. But what I say to them is that perhaps you don't like yourself enough, or that you're afraid of yourself. After all, the self is really harmless once you've seen what it is. And it's okay to like yourself. It's nothing to be ashamed of or to beat around the bush about. We're free to like ourselves and make no apologies over it, even if no one else likes us. Anyway, here's a little poem I wrote about that's just kind of fun, and it's called Me and You. The fact that I like me does not mean that I don't like you. There is room for you in me. And you can like you too. You too are like me. I like you too.